There are those who believe that desperation refines strategy, that when a nation finds itself cornered, when the seas are ruled by enemies and the harbours stand vulnerable as open wounds, ingenuity will rise from necessity like smoke from rubble. But history teaches a darker lesson. Desperation does not refine, it distorts. It takes the rational mind and bends it toward the grotesque, the experimental, the unthinkable. And in that bending, in that frantic search for advantage, men sometimes reach not upward toward brilliance, but downward, into the animal kingdom, conscripting creatures who cannot volunteer, cannot understand, cannot refuse. This is the story of minds attached to dolphins. This story has been classified for decades. What other buried military programs do you think we still don't know about? The year is 1939 and Europe has begun its descent into the abyss. The ocean, that vast indifferent sprawl of salt and depth, has become the most contested territory on Earth. Beneath its surface move the predators of modern war, submarines, sleek and silent, carrying torpedoes that can split a merchant vessel in half. On its surface, the convoys crawl eastward, laden with oil, steel, grain, the lifeblood of nations. And at the edge of every harbour, in every strategic channel, lies the mine, that patient, floating executioner, waiting in the dark for the hull it will kiss with fire. The naval staffs of Britain, Germany, the Soviet Union, and later the United States sit in rooms panelled with oak and hung with maps marked in red. They calculate tonnage, they project losses, they run their fingers along coastlines and ask the question that haunts every admiral: how do we protect what we cannot see? The mine is invisible until it kills. The submarine is invisible until it strikes. Visibility in this war is survival, and so begins the search for eyes beneath the waves. There had been before the war experiments, quiet ones, theoretical ones. In the 1910s and 1920s, scientists in several nations had pondered the intelligence of marine mammals. Dolphins, they observed, possessed a biological sonar, echolocation, far superior to any device yet invented by man. A dolphin could locate a fish in murky water from hundreds of meters away. It could distinguish between species, between sizes, between the living and the dead. Its brain, relative to body size, was massive. Its behavior suggested problem-solving, memory, even something resembling curiosity. Could such an animal, some asked, be trained? Could it be weaponized? By 1940, the question was no longer academic. The German Kriegsmarine, strangled by the Royal Navy's blockade, looked to every edge. The Soviet Northern Fleet guarding Murmansk and the supply lines from Britain faced relentless U-boat predation. The British Admiralty, watching freighters burn off the coast of Scotland, wanted detection systems that could operate where human divers could not, in cold that would kill a man in minutes, in darkness where light was suicide. And quietly, in classified facilities along the coasts, the experiments began. Not one program, not one nation, but several, operating in parallel, each unaware of the other, each driven by the same terrible logic. If a dolphin could find a fish, could it find a mine? If it could find a mine, could it mark it? And if it could mark it, could it deliver something more? The first dolphins were captured off the coast of Norway, the Black Sea, the North Atlantic. Fishermen were contracted, paid in currency or ration vouchers to bring back live specimens. The animals were transported in saltwater tanks to naval research stations, repurposed aquariums, converted lighthouse facilities, concrete basins built behind barbed wire. They were young, mostly, juveniles, easier to handle, easier, the scientists believed, to train. The men assigned to these projects were an odd assemblage: marine biologists who had spent their careers studying migration patterns and breeding cycles, animal trainers borrowed from circuses and oceanariums, naval engineers who understood ordnance but knew nothing of mammalian behaviour, and above them, the officers, men who saw the dolphin not as a creature of wonder but as a tool, a resource, a potential asset in the calculus of survival. They called them swimmers. The training began simply: positive reinforcement, a fish reward for touching a target, a whistle to signal correct behaviour. The dolphins learned quickly, too quickly perhaps. They seemed almost eager to cooperate, their natural playfulness aligning by accident with the goals of their captors. They would swim to markers, nudge objects with their rostrums, retrieve items from the bottom of training pools. But the war was not a pool. The war was the North Sea in winter, where the water temperature hovered just above freezing and visibility dropped to arm's length. The war was the Baltic, mined so heavily that ships moved in narrow corridors, praying. The war was the approaches to Murmansk, where German U-boats waited like wolves at a tree line. And so the training escalated. By late 1941, the programs had moved beyond detection. The Soviets, in particular, driven by losses that were bleeding their merchant fleet dry, began exploring offensive applications. If a Dolphin could be trained to approach a mine, inert, safe, for training purposes, could it be trained to approach a ship? Could it be trained to carry something? The device they developed was crude, a cylindrical mine, smaller than a standard naval mine, affixed to a harness that strapped across the Dolphin's dorsal region. The animal would be released from a small craft or a coastal station. It would swim toward the target, identified by sonar profile, by engine noise, by some acoustic signature the trainers hoped the Dolphin could learn. Upon contact, or upon a signal, the mine would detach. Ideally, it would attach magnetically to the hull. A timer would begin. The Dolphin, theoretically, would swim away. Theoretically. The first live tests conducted in the White Sea in early 1942 were disasters. The Dolphins did not understand. They were not soldiers. They had no ideology, no hatred for the enemy, no concept of sabotage. When released with the devices, some simply refused to approach the targets. Others swam directly back to the trainers, confused, seeking approval, seeking fish. The mines, when triggered, were indiscriminate. In one recorded incident, a Dolphin circled beneath the Soviet training vessel itself, attempting to return, unable to comprehend that the object strapped to its back had become lethal. The mine detonated. The Dolphin died instantly. The vessel took damage. 2 crewmen were injured. The report, filed in a sparse, bureaucratic prose that masked the horror, recommended refinement of behavioural conditioning protocols. But there was no time for refinement. The war was accelerating. Stalingrad was burning. Leningrad was starving. The Atlantic convoys were being torn apart at a rate that threatened Britain's ability to continue the fight. And so the experiments continued, driven not by success but by the absence of alternatives. The British, meanwhile, pursued a different approach. Their programme, headquartered in a facility on the Scottish coast, focused on mine detection rather than mine delivery. The goal was to train Dolphins to locate German acoustic and magnetic mines in harbours and shipping lanes, marking them for human divers or clearance teams. The logic was cleaner, the ethics marginally less horrific, but the results were no better. Dolphins could locate the mines. That much was proven, but they could not mark them reliably. The acoustic transponders attached to the animals malfunctioned in seawater. The visual markers, small buoys meant to be released at the mine's location, tangled in kelp, drifted off course, or were simply ignored by the Dolphins, who did not understand why they should care where a buoy ended up. And then there was the cold. Dolphins, for all their adaptability, are warm water creatures. The North Atlantic in winter was a punishment. The animals developed respiratory infections. Their skin lesioned. Some refused to eat. Others became lethargic, moving through the water as though drugged, their natural grace replaced by a sluggish mechanical propulsion. The trainers tried heated pools. They tried antibiotics when available. They tried rotating the animals, giving them rest periods, but there was no time for rest. The mines were being laid faster than they could be cleared, ships were sinking, men were dying, and so the Dolphins were sent out again and again until their bodies gave out, or until they simply vanished into the grey water and did not return. One British report, dated March 1943, contains a passage that has stayed buried in the archives for decades. It describes an incident in which a trained dolphin, released near Scapa Flow, to survey for mines, instead swam directly into a defensive net meant to keep enemy submarines out. The animal became entangled. By the time the net was raised, the dolphin had drowned. The report's final line, Asset 4 lost to operational environment, recommend discontinuation of cold water deployments pending physiological review. The review never came. The program was classified, its failures unlisted, its costs unmeasured, except in the animals that disappeared from the tanks one by one into the statistics of a war that consumed everything. The Germans too experimented. Less is known of their program, much of the documentation destroyed in the final collapse of the Reich. But fragmentary evidence exists, captured memos, interrogation transcripts from marine engineers taken prisoner in 1945. They speak of trials in the Baltic, using harbour porpoises rather than dolphins, the animal smaller, more common in northern waters. The goal was the same: detection, marking, perhaps delivery. The results were consistent with the others: failure, confusion, death. One interrogation transcript, translated from German, contains a line from a naval technician: "The animal did not betray us, we betrayed the animal." But by 1943, the strategic calculus had shifted. The Allies had developed a better sonar, radar was improving. The convoy system, though costly, was proving sustainable. The desperation that had birthed these programs began to ebb, not because the war was won, but because other, more reliable methods had emerged. The dolphins, the porpoises, the sea lions that had also been conscripted in smaller numbers. They were no longer necessary. The programs were quietly shelved. The animals, those that survived, were released or euthanized or simply abandoned in the concrete basins, left to starve or succumb to infection while the scientists moved on to other projects, other weapons, other fronts. There were no press releases, no public acknowledgements. The work had been classified and it would remain so for decades. The deaths went unrecorded in any official tally. The dolphins that died in training or in live tests or in the open ocean, alone and far from any coastline they would have recognized. Those dolphins do not appear in the casualty lists of World War II. They are absent from the memorials. They have no graves. But they were casualties nonetheless. Because here is the truth that no one wanted to speak aloud, then or now. The mines attached to dolphins were not a story of innovation. They were a story of moral collapse disguised as necessity. They were what happens when men in clean rooms far from the water decide that another kind of life is expendable, that intelligence, if it cannot speak, does not deserve consideration, that suffering, if it is silent, is not suffering at all. The dolphins did not volunteer, they could not comprehend the war, they did not hate the enemy. They had no nation, no flag, no cause. They were taken from the ocean and forced into a conflict that meant nothing to them, trained to carry death that would kill indiscriminately, friend, foe, or themselves. And when the war moved on, when the necessity passed, they were forgotten. There is a document held in the British National Archives that will not be fully declassified until 2045. It is a summary report on marine mammal programs conducted between 1940 and 1944. The language is bureaucratic, clinical. It lists expenditures, personnel hours, asset acquisition and loss rates. Nowhere in the document does it use the word dolphin. Instead, marine asset, unit, biological platform. The final page contains a single recommendation: further development not cost effective, terminate remaining assets and destroy all related documentation. Most of the documentation was destroyed, but not all. In the decades after the war, as archives opened and historians sifted through the wreckage of classified programs, fragments began to emerge. A budget line in a Soviet naval report, a passing reference in a British Admiralty memo, the testimony of a German engineer who, in his old age, spoke to a researcher about the things he had seen in the Baltic. And slowly, the story assembled itself, piece by piece, a mosaic of cruelty and futility. The programs were not unique to the Second World War. In the 1960s, the United States Navy would revive the concept, this time with more success, training dolphins for mine detection and harbour security. Those programs too would be classified. Those animals too would serve without consent. The technology improved. The ethics did not. But the early experiments, the wartime experiments, those first desperate attempts to turn cetacean intelligence into a weapon, those stand apart, not because they failed. Failure is common in war, but because they failed in a way that revealed something essential about how nations think when survival is at stake, that anything can be sacrificed, that any creature can be conscripted, that the moral universe contracts until only the strategic goal remains visible, and everything else, compassion, decency, the recognition of suffering in another being, becomes negotiable. The dolphins could not speak for themselves. They could not refuse. They could not file reports or lodge complaints or demand to be sent home. They could only swim where they were told. To swim, carry what they were told to carry, and die when their bodies or the ocean or the mines decided it was time. And the men who trained them, who strapped explosives to their backs, who sent them into freezing water to chase shadows they could not understand. Those men went home after the war. They returned to families, to peacetime careers, to lives unmarked by the work they had done. Some, perhaps, felt regret. Others rationalized. Most simply moved on. Because that is what war allows. It allows you to do things you would never do in peace, and then it allows you to forget. But the dolphins remember in whatever way their minds allow memory. Or perhaps they do not. Perhaps the ocean, indifferent as always, simply reclaimed them, and the war became a dream they could not articulate, a confusion that faded as the schools reformed and the currents carried them away from the places where men had tried to make them killers. In 1947, a fisherman off the coast of Norway reported seeing a dolphin with scars across its dorsal ridge, marks that looked like harness abrasions. He could not be sure. The animal did not approach his boat. It surfaced once, breathed and then dove, disappearing into the deep water. He thought briefly about the war, about the rumours he had heard of strange experiments, of animals used in ways that didn't make sense. But he was tired. The war was over. There was herring to catch and a market to reach before nightfall. He returned to his nets and did not think of the dolphin again. Somewhere in the archives of the former Soviet Union, in a file box labelled with a designation that means nothing to the uninitiated, there is a photograph. It is black and white, the contrast faded with age. It shows a dolphin in a concrete basin, its skin mottled with infection, its eye, visible in the frame, reflecting the flash of the camera. Around the animal's midsection is a harness, and attached to the harness is a cylindrical device. There is no caption, no date, no indication of what happened next. The photograph is alone in the file. The rest of the documents are missing. Perhaps they were destroyed as the order specified. Perhaps they were lost. Or perhaps they are still there, somewhere deeper in the archives, waiting for a researcher who will never come because the story is too small, too strange, too uncomfortable to fit into the grand narratives of the war. There are no monuments for dolphins, no plaques, no ceremonies on coastal cliffs where civilians gather to remember. There is only the ocean, and the silence, and the knowledge, if knowledge is the right word, that once, in the darkest years of the modern age, men looked at the intelligence of another species and saw only a weapon. That they took creatures capable of joy, of play, of bonds we are only beginning to understand, and tried to turn them into instruments of death. And that when it didn't work, when the dolphins died or fled or simply refused, the programs were shut down not because they were wrong, but because they were inefficient. That is the lesson. Not that we learned, not that we changed, but that efficiency, not morality, determined the outcome. That the dolphins were saved not by conscience, but by calculus. The mines attached to dolphins were never deployed in combat. The few trials that occurred were failures. The animals in the end were unsuitable, too intelligent perhaps to be controlled, too alive to be reduced to platforms. The ocean, it turned out, could not be conscripted as easily as a man, but the fact that it was tried, that in multiple nations simultaneously the decision was made to experiment on creatures who could not consent, who could not understand, who could only suffer, that fact remains. It is a footnote now, a curiosity, a strange chapter in the history of unconventional warfare. But to the dolphins who were captured, trained, harnessed, and sent into the cold water with mines strapped to their backs, it was not a footnote, it was their war. And they did not survive it to tell anyone what it felt like to be used that way, to be made into something they were never meant to be. The ocean holds many graves. Most of them are unmarked. These are no different, except that the ones who died there died for a cause they never knew, in a war they never chose, serving masters who saw them as tools and discarded them as failures. That is the story of the mines attached to dolphins. It is not a story of innovation. It is a story of what we are willing to do when we are afraid, and it is a story we have never apologized for, because the dead cannot hear apologies, and the living have already moved on.